Hi, welcome to Gene Rants. I'm Gene, and today we will be going to the Supreme Court to discuss a very important case, a case that the Supreme Court has just decided that it would hear. It's, what the legal beagles, they call it granting certiorari, or just granting cert for short, for those of you interested in those kind of details. Basically, they agreed to hear a case. This is a case I want to discuss today because, well, it's not a high profile case like Roe v. Wade or the Dobbs decision, which was the decision that overturned Roe v. Wade. It's not getting, it may not be getting the kind of high profile that those cases did, but it is potentially monumental, this case, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to give you a headline from CNN, and I'm going to give you a couple of quotes, and well, let's start with that. So here's the headline. Supreme Court agrees to reconsider precedent that limits who Trump can fire. The Supreme Court agreed Monday to hear a rush appeal that will decide whether President Donald Trump acted lawfully as he has wrested control of independent federal agencies by firing the board members who led them. By granting the case involving the Federal Trade Commission, the High Court said it is ready to answer a question that has swirled around the second Trump administration from its first weeks, whether it should overturn a Roosevelt-era precedent that allowed Congress to protect those independent agencies from the whims of the White House. So the case is, we'll get into it in a moment, but what they're talking about, there's a woman on the Federal Trade Commission. Trump fired her. This is a so-called independent agency, supposedly, created by Congress. There's one more, which is one reason why this is so monumental. The Federal Reserve, the Fed, Jerome Powell, all the members of the board. Trump would love, he actually fired Lisa Cook. I'm sure everybody's heard about that, has fired one member, and she is fighting the dismissal because supposedly, or according to this congressional law that created the agency, that the president can only fire somebody on the Federal Reserve. Otherwise, Powell would have been gone long ago. You can only fire somebody for cause. And then what's a definition of cause? Well, there is no official definition, so why can't the president decide whether something is a cause or not, so on and so forth. But the basic idea is whether this whole idea of creating an independent agency that is beyond Congress also cannot fire as the law currently is. Nobody can fire Jerome Powell or anybody on the board, supposedly, or that's the conventional wisdom right now, at all. So you're really creating a couple of agencies, the Federal Trade Commission and the Federal Reserve, and there may be others that are outside of the control of the government, outside of the Constitution, basically, that as long as they don't do something that constitutes for cause, they are there forever. And Lisa Cook, her term goes, they are on the Federal Trade Commission, I think it's 4 years or 5 years, a reasonable term. The Federal Reserve Board, her term runs until, I think it's 18 years or something, but until 2038. So you have multiple presidents potentially who would not be able to fire her or any member, really, if the president if there's a vacancy, right, appoints a member of the Federal Reserve. That person is in there for, it doesn't mean the chairman, that's completely different, that's a shorter term, but these members of the board, they are there for literally over a decade and almost 2 decades. Can that possibly be constitutional? So that is what is going to be tested. Let me give you, I'll read right from the case. I'll just give you the meat of the matter. The parties are directed to brief and argue the following questions. 1, whether the statutory removal protections for members of the Federal Trade Commission violate the separation of powers, and if so, whether Humphrey's executor versus the United States 295 U.S. 602, 1935, should be overruled. And 2, whether a federal court may prevent a person's removal from public office, either through relief at equity or at law. The clerk is directed to establish a briefing schedule that will allow the case to be argued in the December 2025 argument session. So the case will be argued in December, and I understand that a decision would be rendered in the summer of 2026. Now, the question is, well, there are 2 questions there, and we'll take the second one first, and that is whether a court, well, you've had all these rules. Trump fires somebody, and some jerk judge in some district court, I mean, they're 94, 92, or 94 in the country, so somebody finds a court somewhere with a liberal justice and orders Trump to reinstate somebody is fired, or just says you cannot fire that person. And that is the first question, whether a district court can do that. It's the matter of the separation of powers, which brings us to the first question. That's what we're talking about. Humphrey's executor is the case. It's as I just quoted, it was decided in 1935, 90 years, and what it was I forget which agency it was, but the Roosevelt, the FDR administration created with Congress an agency, or I forget which one it was, but an independent agency, and Roosevelt fired somebody on it, and that person sued, went to court. It made its way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, there are certain agencies it's possible to create an independent agency, and therefore FDR could not fire that person. And then, so Trump, now moving forward to today, cannot fire anybody on the Federal Trade Commission or on the Federal Reserve. Now, this woman who her name escapes me, but she was fired from the FTC, and what happened was the Trump administration went to the Supreme Court and asked for an emergency ruling to allow the firing, and then asking the court to reverse the Humphrey's executor. So what they did is it's in that, it's in the beginning there, from where I took this quote, that the president they said, okay, yeah, you can fire that person, you can fire anybody now temporarily while this case is being heard, until it's heard and decided next summer. So that's a pretty good indication that Humphrey's executor is going to be overturned, because you only need 4 justices to hear a case, right? So 4 justices and just 5 5-4 decision to reverse Humphreys, to make any decision. So if you have 4 judges justices wanting to hear that case, that is a very strong indication that you have 4 justices, at least 4. They say you need 4 to agree to grant cert to hear the case, but there could have been more than 4. But you have at least 4 that would seem to be predisposed to overturn, to reverse Humphreys, by the fact that they are agreeing to hear this case. Now, what does this mean going forward, depending on how the Supreme Court decides? Now, if they decides to keep Humphreys, and that means that Trump cannot fire the people that he has he cannot fire Lisa Cook unless he can show for cause, and I don't know how that works. Who defines for cause? That's number one. But number 2, that woman on the Federal Trade Commission presumably would get her job back. But the big deal is the Federal Reserve, because the whole a lot of the confidence in the American economic system, why people invested in this country, is because of an independent Fed. Well, if Humphreys is overturned, then that goes out the window. Trump can fire everybody. I assume he can fire anybody he wants, hire anybody he wants, and the danger is, or the presumed danger, because remember, everybody predicted these horrible results from the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade, and we see, the sky hasn't fallen down. You have to remember, well, people say if the president can say, well, I want low interest rates, and I will just hire only people who vote to lower interest rates, and if somebody votes to raise an interest rate, I'm going to fire them. That's the fear, or as they put it, that we could become Venezuela. Now, the difference between Venezuela and here is Venezuela. Well, we see they kind of rigged their elections a little bit. Maduro has been in there forever, and they just put their opponents in jail. It's also happened in Brazil. Bolsonaro was he opposing? There is questions whether who won the election in Brazil, but he was accused of. And Da Silva is the president of Brazil, and he just imprisoned Bolsonaro. So that's what we're talking about here. So, but the United States, we do have a bona fide stable political system, and we do have elections every 4 years of president of the president. So the president can be held, we can hold him accountable if he does just hire his people to give him the policies he wants. And there's a counter argument to that, which is, we'll say Powell, so he can't fire Powell, but Powell's term will expire in May, and then Trump will be able to fire him and put in anybody who he wants. So at the end of the day, as Fed Reserve terms, and he's already appointed people to the Fed, he can appoint people. He can do it. It's just a matter of timing of when he can do it. So that doesn't quite wash with me. But the main thing, well, there are two main things, and the first one is that people talk about a president who will willy-nilly raise and lower interest rates, but there's also a wider debate here, which is philosophy, economic philosophy. Now, we know everybody's heard of Keynesianism and John Maynard Keynes, and maybe you've heard of the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve says that is the belief that if you have full employment and you have a booming economy, that's inflationary, that the economy is overheating, and that the Fed has to raise interest rates to rein it in. Now, we've had, ever since Reagan, we've had periods of booming economies, and there has been no inflation during these periods. And to me, it's obvious, because when you have everybody working, that means everybody is producing. So when you're producing, it's inflation comes from demand exceeding supply. But when you have all these people working, and so they're earning income, and so that's your demand, but the money is not just given to them. That's where you get inflation, like we had during COVID. During the Biden administration, Inflation Reduction, misnamed Inflation Reduction Act, that just flooded money into the economy that was not the result of productive work, and so you had inflation. But if people are getting paid for producing products, well, then you have the products for people to buy, and you don't have the inflation. That should be obvious. But you have people on the Reserve Fed, on the Fed, who believe in the Phillips curve when it's totally nonsense. And so the president should not be a president who knows that's nonsense, that it's not that there, who knows that he should not be stuck with Keynesians. He should not be stuck with Keynesians for his entire term, or for most of his term. And conversely, if you believe in the Phillips curve and you are a Keynesian, and why should that person be be stuck with somebody who does with a Fed that does not believe in the Phillips curve. So you see the problem there. But there's also the constitutional question, separation of powers. Well, first of all, let me just before I get to the next one, just backtrack for a moment, because the other thing, suppose a president runs on the a platform of, when I'm elected, uh, I will only appoint members of the Fed, board members, who will lower interest rates. I want lower interest rates. So then the decision is up to us, the American people. If we vote that person in the office, and presumably we agree with him, we want him to lower interest rates. If that is the case, why do we have to wait for, if Trump campaigned, he didn't, but if he I don't think, campaigned on a promise or a commitment to lower interest rates, why does he have to wait until May of 26 to fire Powell? If we voted that for that policy, why can it not be instituted right away? Then you have the idea that if Trump just willing to, no, even Biden, no president is that stupid that they will destabilize the markets by just going in and firing everybody, or threatening firing. There will be some caution there. That's number one. But number two, there would be the results would be the main would be the main judgment, the main determination. If the president fires people and hires other people, and you have a booming economy and you don't have inflation, well, then that was a right decision. And why should that decision have been delayed? But now we get to the second part, which is the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution of the United States, we the people run this country. We elect people, essentially hire people to represent us. We hire a president who represents the whole country. We have senators who represent their states. We have senators who represent their states, and the representatives who represent districts, parts of the states. And then the president appoints Supreme Court justices, and they are they have to be approved by the Senate. We the people rule. So, but then there's a Federal Reserve and a Federal Trade Commission where the people do not rule, where they're independent. When you say independent of what? They're saying, well, independent of the Constitution, of the president. No, independent of the Constitution of the United States. And that cannot be acceptable. No, I mean, we have a lot of these. There's another one, Wickard versus Filburn. I'm not going to get into that. These New Deal during Roosevelt. The Supreme Court was striking down things that he wanted to do because they were unconstitutional. So what he did was, he was elected for 4 terms. He was first he tried packing the court. That didn't work. Even Democrats pushed back on that. But over 4 terms, he was eventually able to create a Supreme Court, all of his employees to do, all of his nominees to do what he wanted, what everybody's supposed to be so afraid of. It just took him a longer time to do it, but he eventually got a Supreme Court that would start ruling in favor of his New Deal policies. And Humphreys was one of those from 1935. The other one was major one was Wickard versus Filburn, which we can talk about that some other day. It doesn't matter. I mean, right or wrong, it's pretty much settled law now. No Supreme Court is going to touch it. In my opinion. Anyways, getting back to the upcoming case, as I said, you have a Constitution, and you have also, so you should not be able to create some kind of agency that is outside of the Constitution, outside of control of the Congress, because if you remember, Congress, they say, created this agency, but now it's out of the control of the Congress, out of the control of the president, just out of, independent of we, the American, independent of us, the American people. But also, there's the issue of separation of powers. Now, if the The Senator Chuck Schumer has somebody on his staff that he doesn't like, and he wants to fire that person. Can the president say, no, you can't fire that person? Or if Schumer fires somebody, no, you have to rehire that person? Can the president tell a Supreme Court justice if who the Supreme Court can hire and fire? If the Supreme Court wants to fire a clerk or somebody in the copy room, the president can say, no, you can't do that. Or Congress can tell the president, can tell the Supreme Court, you can't fire so-and-so, vice versa. But Congress seems to believe, and a lot of people believe, that if the president can't tell Chuck Schumer, a senator, that you cannot fire so and so, can Chuck Schumer tell Donald Trump you can't fire so and so? And that's and actually the Congress isn't even saying that. That's what I say, independent agency, that they just decided in 1935 or whenever in 1935, ever since that once that person is in office, then nobody can fire that person. The president can't, but the Congress can't either. And presumably, they may have the right to do that next summer. That is what is going to be decided. And that's why I say, I've gone on quite a bit on this, but I hope you'll understand why that is a very important question, because then, for all practical purposes, for good or ill, we will not have an independent Fed. And in my opinion, the Fed should not be independent, because we don't have, right now, we have the idea is, right, I guess I can end on this. The idea of this independence is to have a Fed that is above politics, a non-politicized Fed. But we have a highly politicized Fed. Jerome Powell is very political, and I would believe the people on the board too, a lot of them. Lisa Cook would be one of them. If she wasn't politicized before, she probably is now, that Trump wanted to fire her. But you have Trump did fire her, and she's fighting it. But Powell, right, 45 days before the 2024 election, Powell, I think it was the 2024 election, 45 days before an election, Powell cut the interest rates by 50 basis points right before an election. Now, Trump into his 8th term, and inflation is no worse than it was then, and Powell has been refusing to lower interest rates until this most recent meeting. He finally did, by a measly quarter of a point. And actually, Steve Myron, the latest Trump appointee, he dissented. He said it should be a half a point. And actually, I don't know. I mean, you have inflation on one hand, I think it's running 2.9, and the target is supposed to be 2. On the other hand, we are at 4 something. I don't know exactly what it is now after the cut, but 4 something, and inflation is running at 2.9. It should be about maybe 3%. There's no reason for the Fed rate to be higher than inflation, really. That's basically it. In fact, you could even argue that get rid of the Fed and just set the interest rate periodically at at the average inflation rate, let's say, for the previous 3 months, something like that. And that's another subject for another day. That the Fed, people have talked about, why do we have a Fed? It's the I'll give you a little preview here. Yeah, since I'm talking, that's why it's called Gene Rants. But do you know, from the day that the Constitution was ratified, right, from that day until 1913, and why do I say 1913? You'll see in a moment if you don't know already. But from over a century, from 1789 until 1913, it took in 1913 $1.15 to buy what a dollar could in 1789. In other words, over 100 years, the value of the dollar went down by 15 cents. But since the Fed was created in 1913, supposedly to control the economy and have a better, more stable economy, it now costs today over $38 to buy what a dollar would buy in 1913. So you see how we had a more stable. We were much more. The value of the dollar was more stable. It was pegged to gold. That's another thing we can get into. So maybe I'll talk about the Fed and Richard Nixon. That was the worst decision, taking us off the gold standard. And he did it because the welfare state, our welfare state was failing. That's basically it. We couldn't pay for it anymore. We didn't have enough gold backing enough dollars to pay for all these Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, blah, 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 pay all these government programs. We no longer had the money, so he just took us off the gold standard. What happened is I keep going on, I guess, is that the dollar is backed by gold. It's got the federal. Well, you know what? I'm not going to talk about it now, unless you request it. This is long enough, and we're getting off the subject. The main thing is Humphreys versus Executor. That is the court case that will be coming up to decide whether to overturn Humphreys versus Executor. I hope I explained that is that is an important case. And it's something that really should be covered. And I'll just end on that. So thanks a lot for stopping by. Your comments welcome. If you're want to, comment section below the video. Share this video with anyone you think would benefit from it. But most of all, come back and see me again. I would love to see all of you again. And until I do see all of you again, bye.